In the humid streets of Savannah, Georgia, a faded daguerreotype from 1836 revealed something historians had tried to forget. The image showed a woman of impeccable posture standing before her plantation house, her expression frozen in aristocratic pride. But what captured attention in 2019 wasn't her silk dress or the mansion's columns. It was the barely visible scars on the necks of 7 enslaved people standing behind her, each bearing an identical symbol that resembled neither a letter nor a number. Margaret Whitmore, known locally as the Savannah Duchess for her airs of European nobility despite never crossing the Atlantic, ran Whitmore Hall with an iron fist and a darker obsession. Court records mention her only briefly, a wealthy widow who inherited 300 acres and 47 enslaved souls when her husband died in 1834. What those records never mentioned was the ritual she performed on 7 specific individuals, or what she buried with them when they disappeared from plantation ledgers between 1836 and 1839. For 180 years, the Whitmore family maintained their position in Savannah society. The plantation house became a historic landmark. The family mausoleum, an imposing structure of white marble on the edge of Bonaventure Cemetery, remained sealed and pristine. No one questioned the 7 names etched in small letters at the base of Margaret's own monument, names without surnames, without dates, without explanation. Until 2022, when Hurricane Ian's flooding destabilized the cemetery grounds and cracked the mausoleum's foundation. What preservation workers discovered inside would force Savannah to confront a truth its elite had buried for nearly 2 centuries, a truth written in blood, carved in bone, and sealed in marble with a promise that could never be kept. This is the story of 7 souls whose names were stolen, whose deaths were hidden, and whose final resting place became a monument to the woman who destroyed them. This is the story of what happens when silence becomes complicity, and when truth waits nearly 200 years to be heard. Chapter 1. The Daguerreotype. Nearly 189 years ago, in a plantation house overlooking the marshlands outside Savannah, Georgia, military correspondence and merchant records mentioned a case so disturbing that it ended up buried in institutional silence. Margaret Whitmore disappeared from all social records after 1839, but not from the whispered warnings passed down through generations of the enslaved community. Her absence from history books left scars deeper than any physical wound, marking bloodlines with a trauma so profound that descendants would spend lifetimes trying to understand what their ancestors had endured. Before we go further, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The discovery began in 2019, when Dr. Amelia Torres, a historical preservationist cataloging private collections for the Savannah Historical Society, opened a leather portfolio that had been sealed since 1891. Inside lay 17 daguerreotypes from the antebellum period, most showing typical plantation scenes, cotton fields, the big house, formal family portraits. But the 18th image stopped her cold. The photograph showed Margaret Whitmore in full regalia, her dark dress adorned with imported lace, her hair arranged in the severe style of wealthy Southern women. She stood on the plantation's front portico, one hand resting on a marble column, the other holding what appeared to be a small book bound in dark leather. Behind her, arranged in 2 rows, stood 7 enslaved individuals, 4 women, 3 men, all with their eyes cast downward in the mandatory pose of submission. Dr. Torres had seen hundreds of such photographs. What made her reach for a magnifying glass was the marking visible on each person's neck. In the grainy detail of early photography, she could make out identical symbols, not the typical brand marks used to identify property, but something more elaborate. The mark resembled a compass rose merged with what looked like letters from no alphabet she recognized, forming a circular design approximately 2 inches in diameter. She spent 3 weeks researching before finding a single reference. In a private journal kept by a Charleston physician, Dr. Edmund Hayes, who had treated several Savannah planters in the 1830s, she found a cryptic entry dated March 1837. Called to Whitmore Hall on urgent matter, found 7 individuals bearing unusual scarification on the throat and upper chest region. The widow insisted these were tribal markings from Africa, but the precision and uniformity suggested otherwise. Most disturbing was the infection in 3 cases, suggesting recent application. Treated wounds but was forbidden from recording details in official medical log. The woman's eyes held something I can only describe as zealous conviction. The journal entry ended with a single line that Dr. Hayes had later crossed out so heavily it took infrared photography to read. She claims they are bound to her body and soul, unto death and beyond. Dr. Torres brought the photograph to a weekly meeting of the Low Country Historical Preservation Committee, where it caused immediate controversy. Some members dismissed it as a photographic artifact or natural scarring. Others recognized what it represented, evidence of a practice so taboo that even in a society built on enslaving human beings, it was considered beyond acceptable bounds. Margaret Whitmore had branded 7 people with her personal sigil, a mark that claimed not just their labor or their bodies, but something deeper. The practice had a name in whispered conversations among the enslaved community: soul marking. It was the ultimate act of ownership, a declaration that even death would not free them from her dominion. The committee voted 8-3 to bury the finding. The photograph was too inflammatory, the evidence too circumstantial, the implications too disturbing for public discourse. 2 members threatened to resign if the image was published. The Whitmore family still held considerable influence in Savannah, with descendants serving on museum boards, preservation committees, and the Chamber of Commerce. But Dr. Torres made a copy before returning the original to the archives. She began her own investigation, knowing that somewhere in Savannah's careful silence, there had to be more evidence. Plantation ledgers, court records, cemetery registries. Something had to mention what happened to those 7 people whose faces stared out from that photograph with expressions carefully schooled to reveal nothing. What she didn't know was that Hurricane Ian would do in minutes what she couldn't accomplish in 3 years of research. The storm wouldn't just crack open the Whitmore family mausoleum. It would release a truth that had been literally buried under marble and lies, waiting for the moment when silence could no longer be maintained. The 7 people in that photograph had names that Margaret Whitmore erased from every official record. But their story, written in scars and sealed in stone, was about to be told at last. Chapter 2. The Duchess of Whitmore Hall. Margaret Whitmore arrived in Savannah in 1829 as Margaret Ashford, the daughter of a Baltimore shipping merchant whose fortune had collapsed in the Panic of 1819. She was 32 years old, unmarried, and desperate. A dangerous combination in a woman who had grown accustomed to wealth and its privileges. Her marriage to Thomas Whitmore, a widower 20 years her senior, was arranged through a Charleston matchmaker who specialized in pairing northern women with southern planters. Thomas Whitmore owned 300 acres of rice fields along the Ogeechee River, worked by 47 enslaved men, women, and children. The plantation produced modest profits, enough to maintain the big house and a respectable social position, but far from the wealth Margaret had known as a girl. She spent her first 3 years as Thomas's wife learning to manage a household that required overseeing not just domestic staff, but the entire economic engine of a working plantation. Letters preserved in the Georgia Historical Society reveal a woman increasingly frustrated by her husband's weak temperament toward the people he enslaved. Thomas followed the paternalistic model common among some planters, strict but not deliberately cruel, providing basic medical care and avoiding the separation of families when possible. Margaret found this approach inefficient and sentimental. When Thomas died suddenly in 1834, the cause listed as heart failure, though Dr. Hayes's private notes mention symptoms inconsistent with natural cardiac distress. Margaret inherited everything. Under Georgia law, a widow had full control of her deceased husband's property for life. At 37, Margaret Whitmore became the sole mistress of Whitmore Hall. The changes were immediate. She dismissed the overseer her husband had employed for 15 years, hiring instead Jacob Moreland, a man known throughout the region for his brutality. She implemented a new system of labor quotas that required each person to produce 20% more than previous standards. Those who failed faced public punishment, whipping posts erected near the cotton gin where the entire enslaved community could be forced to watch. But it was in 1836 that Margaret's true nature revealed itself. That spring, she began selecting specific individuals for what she called her Inner circle. The criteria were never written down, but survivors would later tell their children that the Duchess chose people she considered special, those with skills in healing, those who could read despite it being illegal, those who showed what she interpreted as spiritual gifts. 7 people were chosen. Rachel, a woman who served as the community's midwife and healer. Isaiah, a carpenter whose woodworking was so precise that other planters tried to hire him. Dinah, who had been teaching enslaved children to read in secret. Thomas, sharing the deceased master's name, perhaps a calculated choice, who was known for his ability to predict weather and find water. Mary and Sarah, sisters who led prayer circles. And Benjamin, a young man of barely 20, who had learned blacksmithing and could forge tools, locks, and chains. Margaret began holding private ceremonies in a brick building behind the main house, a structure that had served as Thomas's office, but which she had converted into what she called her chapel. Neighbors noted the sound of chanting at odd hours. The plantation's enslaved community whispered about candles burning through the night, about Margaret's obsession with a leather-bound book she kept locked in a cabinet, about her claims that she had discovered the true nature of the bond between master and slave. In September 1836, the 7 were brought to the chapel. What happened there was never officially recorded, but the physician Dr. Hayes would note in his journal, weeks later, treating the infected wounds on their necks and chests. The marking wasn't done with the typical branding irons used on livestock. Margaret had commissioned a silver seal, ornately designed, that could be heated and pressed against human skin with precision. The symbol itself defied easy interpretation. Some who saw it said it resembled an ancient alchemical symbol. Others thought it looked like a family crest corrupted into something darker. A few recognized elements from West African spiritual traditions, twisted and recombined. Margaret herself claimed it was a blood sigil, a mark that bound their essence to hers, making them hers not just in law but in some deeper cosmic sense. After the marking, the 7 were given new roles. They no longer worked in the fields or performed typical plantation labor. Instead, they attended Margaret in the chapel, participated in her ceremonies, and lived in a separate building where they were isolated from the rest of the community. Margaret referred to them as her consecrated, her bound ones, her 7 vessels. To the other enslaved people at Whitmore Hall, the 7 became objects of both pity and fear. They had been chosen for something terrible, marked in a way that went beyond the usual horrors of slavery. Their isolation was complete. They ate separately, slept separately, spoke only when Margaret commanded. Those who tried to communicate with them were severely punished. Letters from neighboring plantation owners to Margaret during this period reveal growing concern. Mrs. Helena Beaumont of Beaumont Acres wrote in April 1837, "Your recent practices have become the subject of much discussion. While I understand your desire for order and efficiency, I must caution that certain boundaries exist even within the unfortunate necessity of our peculiar institution." Margaret's response, preserved in the same archives, was chilling in its brevity. "What I do with my property is my concern alone. Those who have been consecrated are mine in ways you cannot comprehend." By 1838, rumors had spread throughout Savannah's enslaved community that something was terribly wrong at Whitmore Hall. Underground networks that carried news between plantations spoke of disappearances, of the 7 being seen less and less frequently, of Margaret's increasing obsession with her ceremonies and her book. Then, in January 1839, all 7 names vanished from the plantation ledgers. No sale records, no death certificates, no transfer documents. They simply ceased to exist in any official capacity, as if Margaret had found a way to erase them from the world entirely. And in March 1839, Margaret Whitmore herself withdrew from all social functions. She stopped attending church, hosting visitors, or conducting any business beyond the plantation's immediate needs. For the next 17 years, until her death in 1856, she lived as a recluse, served only by enslaved people who were rotated regularly to prevent them from learning too much about what happened in that brick chapel. The Savannah Duchess had sealed her secret. But secrets, like bodies, don't stay buried forever. Chapter 3. The Silence. The years following 1839 were marked by a silence so profound that it became its own form of evidence. Margaret Whitmore continued to run the plantation through intermediaries, but she was rarely seen outside the main house. The brick chapel remained locked, its windows covered with heavy curtains. The building where the seven had lived stood empty, slowly deteriorating as no one was allowed to repair it or enter it. When Margaret died in 1856 at age 59, her will contained specific instructions. The plantation was to be sold, with proceeds divided among distant relatives in Baltimore, but the chapel and the separate building were to be demolished entirely. Their foundations dug up and the earth salted. Her body was to be interred in a specially constructed family mausoleum in what would become Bonaventure Cemetery, and 7 names were to be carved at the base of her monument, names without dates, without relationships, without explanation. The will's executors followed her instructions precisely. The chapel was torn down brick by brick, and workers reported finding strange items buried beneath the floorboards, bones arranged in patterns, scraps of cloth covered in writing, jars of preserved substances no one could identify. All of it was burned. The earth was indeed salted, as if Margaret feared something might grow there. The mausoleum construction was overseen by a master mason from Charleston, brought in specifically for the project. He created a structure of white marble, imposing and elegant, with Margaret's name carved prominently on the front. The 7 other names were placed at the base, so small they were barely visible: Rachel, Isaiah, Dinah, Thomas, Mary, Sarah, Benjamin. No one in Margaret's family questioned these names or their placement. They accepted the explanation that these were faithful servants who had died in service to the household. This lie was recorded in the mausoleum's dedication document and became part of Savannah's historical record. But the enslaved community at Whitmore Hall, which was dispersed to other plantations after the estate sale, carried a different story. They passed it down through generations, a warning to their children and grandchildren about what happened when power combined with darkness, when human ownership expanded beyond the physical into realms it should never touch. The oral histories spoke of what people heard coming from the chapel in those final months. Voices crying out, not in pain exactly, but in confusion and despair. The sound of Margaret's voice, chanting in languages no one recognized, and on one terrible night in December 1838, screams that were cut short, one by one, 7 times. They spoke of what happened afterward when Margaret emerged from the chapel alone, her dress stained, her hands shaking, her expression one of triumph mixed with something that looked like terror. They spoke of how she had the 7 bodies moved, not buried in the plantation cemetery where enslaved people were typically interred, but taken to the unfinished foundation of what would become her mausoleum. They spoke of Margaret's claims that she had bound them to her eternally, that she had completed the great work, that the 7 would serve her beyond death as they had in life. And they spoke of the curse that some believed followed the Whitmore family afterward: marriages that ended in tragedy, children who died young, fortunes that evaporated despite every advantage. Whether supernatural or simply the karmic weight of such crimes, the Whitmore descendants never seemed to prosper as their wealth and position should have allowed. But these were oral histories, dismissed by white historians as superstition and exaggeration. No official investigation was conducted. No charges were filed. Margaret Whitmore died wealthy and respected, her crimes buried under marble and silence. For 166 years, the mausoleum stood untouched. Generations of Whitmore descendants visited it, leaving flowers and maintaining its pristine appearance. Tourists walked past it on cemetery tours, admiring its architectural beauty without knowing what lay beneath. The 7 names at its base were noted but never questioned, absorbed into the general tragedy of slavery without recognition of the specific horror they represented. Until 2022, when Hurricane Ian made landfall near Savannah. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts can reach. The storm's fury lasted 14 hours. When it passed, Bonaventure Cemetery was devastated. Ancient trees had fallen across graves, marble monuments were knocked from their foundations, and flooding had undermined entire sections of the historic grounds. The Whitmore Mausoleum appeared intact from the outside, but preservation workers who approached it noticed something alarming. The entire structure had shifted on its foundation, creating a visible crack along the eastern wall. Georgia historical preservation regulations required immediate documentation and stabilization. A team led by structural engineer Marcus Chen and forensic archaeologist Dr. Sarah Morrison arrived 3 days after the storm. Their job was to assess the damage, document what they found, and determine if the mausoleum could be saved or needed to be rebuilt. When they opened the bronze doors, which had been sealed for decades, they expected to find what was typical in such structures: burial vaults, perhaps some family artifacts, the accumulated dust of time. What they found instead would force Savannah to confront a truth it had spent 183 years trying to forget. Chapter 4. The Unsealing. The interior of the Whitmore Mausoleum was larger than typical family crypts, approximately 20 feet square with a domed ceiling rising 15 feet at its center. Margaret Whitmore's marble sarcophagus dominated the space, elevated on a platform 3 steps above the floor. The walls held several smaller niches, presumably for other family members, though only 2 had been used, distant cousins who had died in the late 1800s. But it was what lay beneath Margaret's sarcophagus that stopped the preservation team cold. The storm's damage had shifted the entire platform, revealing a gap that shouldn't exist. Marcus Chen directed his flashlight into the opening and saw stairs descending into darkness. "There's a lower chamber," he said, his voice tight with tension. "This isn't in any of the original architectural plans." Dr. Morrison photographed every step as they descended. The stairs were narrow, carved directly into the earth and reinforced with brick. 15 steps down, they entered a circular chamber approximately 12 feet in diameter, with a ceiling so low Marcus had to stoop. The air smelled of earth and something else, something organic and old that made both of them instinctively cover their mouths. 7 stone platforms ringed the chamber's perimeter, each large enough to hold a human body. On each platform lay skeletal remains, positioned identically, on their backs, arms crossed over their chests, legs straight. But it was what surrounded the skeletons that sent Dr. Morrison reaching for her phone to call the police, even though she knew these deaths had occurred over 180 years ago. Each skeleton bore evidence of trauma. The cervical vertebrae showed marks consistent with ligature strangulation. The bones displayed signs of malnutrition and repetitive stress injuries typical of enslaved people, subjected to harsh labor. And most disturbing, each skull showed evidence of perimortem trauma, injuries sustained at or very near the time of death. But the skeletal evidence, horrifying as it was, could be explained by the violence inherent in slavery. What couldn't be explained was everything else in the chamber. The walls had been painted with symbols, the same circular sigil visible in the 1836 photograph, repeated hundreds of times in concentric circles. The paint had been made with iron oxide, giving it a rust-red color that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Analysis would later confirm that the paint did contain human blood mixed with mineral pigments. At the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, roughly 3 feet square. On it lay the remnants of a book. The leather binding had survived, but the pages had deteriorated into fragments. Enough remained to see that the text was handwritten in a mixture of languages and symbols, some recognizable as Latin, others appearing to be corrupted versions of West African spiritual writings. Most disturbing were the iron chains. Each skeleton was bound to its platform with chains that ran through iron rings set into the stone. The chains connected to a central point beneath the altar, where they all joined in a complex knot that would have required mathematical precision to create. Even in death, Margaret had kept them bound. Dr. Morrison spent 4 hours documenting everything before allowing the police to enter. Detective James Wilson of the Savannah Police Department stood in the doorway of the chamber and simply said, "We're going to need the FBI." The investigation that followed involved multiple agencies. The FBI's Civil Rights Cold Case Unit, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Historical Crimes Division, forensic anthropologists from the University of Georgia, historians from the Equal Justice Initiative, all descended on the mausoleum to document what Margaret Whitmore had done. Forensic analysis of the skeletons revealed their identities through a combination of genetic testing, historical records, and comparisons with descendants. Rachel, the midwife; Isaiah, the carpenter; Dinah, who taught children to read; Thomas, the water finder; Mary and Sarah, the sisters who led prayers; and Benjamin, the young blacksmith. All 7, murdered and hidden in a secret crypt beneath their murderer's monument. The dating of the deaths was consistent. All occurred within a 2-week period in late 1838 or early 1839. The method of death appeared to be ritualistic strangulation, based on the consistency of the skeletal evidence. Margaret hadn't just killed them. She had performed what she believed was a ceremony that would bind their souls to hers eternally. The leather book, once painstakingly reconstructed by preservation experts, revealed Margaret's complete descent into an obsessive belief system that mixed corrupted elements of various spiritual traditions. She had convinced herself that by marking and binding these 7 people, by killing them in a specific ritual manner, she could ensure their service to her beyond death. The final entries in the book were the most disturbing. Written in Margaret's increasingly erratic hand, they described her success in completing the great work and her belief that she now controlled the 7 souls in this world and the next. She wrote of hearing their voices, of commanding them even in death, of the power she felt having broken the final barrier between master and slave. It was the grandiose delusion of someone who had taken the already monstrous practice of enslaving human beings and pushed it into realms of psychological and spiritual cruelty that defied comprehension. News of the discovery spread rapidly. The story made national headlines. Georgia plantation owner's secret crypt reveals ritual murders from 1838. The Whitmore family, which had maintained its position in Savannah society for generations, issued a statement expressing horror and shame, offering to fund the proper burial of the 7 victims. But the community's reaction was more complex. For descendants of enslaved people, particularly those who could trace their lineage to Whitmore Hall, the discovery was both vindication and reopened trauma. The oral histories their ancestors had preserved, dismissed for generations as exaggeration or superstition, were proven true. The whispered warnings about what happened in Margaret's chapel had been accurate. Churches throughout Savannah held memorial services. The 7 names, which had been carved in shame at the base of a monument to their murderer, were now spoken aloud with reverence and sorrow. A movement began to properly honor their memory, not as Margaret's victims alone, but as people who had lived full lives before she destroyed them. Dr. Amelia Torres, who had started the investigation 3 years earlier with a photograph, stood in the chamber and felt the weight of those 183 years. They were kept silent twice, as she said, first by murder, then by history, but silence can only last so long. The question now was what to do with Margaret Whitmore's mausoleum and how to memorialize the 7 people she had murdered and hidden beneath her monument to herself. Chapter 5. The 7. As forensic historians worked to reconstruct the identities of the 7 victims, a more complete picture emerged of who they had been before Margaret Whitmore selected them for her horrific ritual. These weren't just names carved in stone. They were people with skills, families, hopes, and lives that had been brutally cut short. Rachel was approximately 40 years old when she died. Born in South Carolina, she had been sold to Thomas Whitmore in 1821. She served as the plantation's primary midwife and healer, with knowledge of herbal medicine that she had learned from her mother and grandmother. Survivors remembered her as someone who saved countless lives, both enslaved people and white family members who would accept her ministrations when officially trained physicians were unavailable or ineffective. Her healing skills were likely what drew Margaret's attention. In the twisted logic of the Duchess, Rachel's ability to preserve life made her valuable for whatever Margaret believed her ritual would achieve. Isaiah was 35, a master carpenter whose furniture was so exquisitely crafted that pieces made by him still exist in museums and private collections, though they were never attributed to him during his lifetime. He had taught himself to read using scraps of newspaper he found, a dangerous act that could result in severe punishment if discovered. His craftsmanship was more than labor. It was art, precision, and a demonstration of intelligence that white society refused to acknowledge except when it profited from his work. The detail and precision that made him valuable to Margaret were the same qualities she believed would make him a perfect component in her ritual. Dinah was barely 28. She had taken the dangerous step of teaching enslaved children to read, holding secret lessons in the woods beyond the plantation boundaries. She used Bible verses as texts, believing that if reading was framed as religious instruction, the risk might be somewhat reduced. At least 15 children learned their letters from Dinah before Margaret discovered her activities, and rather than punishing her publicly, selected her for the inner circle. Dinah's ability to teach, to pass on knowledge, to help others transcend their circumstances. These marked her as special in Margaret's eyes. Thomas was 52, the oldest of the 7. His reputation for predicting weather patterns and finding water sources wasn't supernatural, though some called it that. He simply paid attention to natural signs with a precision born from necessity. Enslaved people who could predict storms protected everyone from dangerous work conditions. Those who could find water sources ensured survival. Thomas had saved the plantation from crop failures multiple times by warning of coming droughts or floods. Margaret interpreted his practical wisdom as something mystical, something she wanted to control. Mary and Sarah were sisters, 32 and 29 respectively. They had been born at Whitmore Hall and had never been separated, a rare mercy in a system that routinely destroyed families. They led prayer circles among the enslaved community, providing spiritual comfort and maintaining hope in unbearable circumstances. Their faith was deep and genuine, offering strength to others when everything else had been stripped away. To Margaret, their spiritual leadership made them perfect candidates for what she called her sacred work. Benjamin was the youngest at 22. He had been trained as a blacksmith and showed extraordinary talent for metalwork. He could forge tools, repair equipment, and create intricate decorative pieces. He was also the father of 2 young children, a boy and a girl, who would grow up never knowing what happened to their father. His youth and strength, combined with his craftsmanship, made him valuable to Margaret for reasons she never fully explained in her writings. These 7 represented the best of what enslaved people created, despite the system designed to destroy them: healing, artistry, education, wisdom, faith, and skill. They were leaders, teachers, and providers for their community. Their loss was felt not just by their immediate families, but by the entire enslaved population at Whitmore Hall. Oral histories collected from descendants revealed more details. Rachel had delivered over 300 babies during her time at the plantation. Isaiah had built the church where enslaved people were allowed to worship on Sundays. Dinah's students went on to teach others, creating a chain of literacy that survived the war and Reconstruction. Thomas had used his knowledge to help people escape, providing information about weather conditions that made flight safer. Mary and Sarah had maintained spiritual practices that connected people to their African heritage. Benjamin had secretly forged tools that made escape possible for some and work less punishing for others. They were, in every sense, the heart of the community. Their selection by Margaret wasn't random. She specifically chose people whose removal would be most damaging, whose absence would be most deeply felt. Whether she understood the full impact of her choices or simply recognized their value through her own twisted lens, the result was the same. She destroyed not just 7 lives, but the center of a community's strength. The families they left behind were forced to live with uncertainty. No bodies to mourn over, no graves to visit, no closure. Just absence and the terrible knowledge, whispered but never confirmed, that Margaret had done something unspeakable to their loved ones. Parents lost children. Children lost parents. Spouses lost partners. Siblings lost each other. And they all had to continue living and working under the authority of the woman who had murdered their family members. After the war, when slavery ended and the Whitmore plantation was sold off, the descendants of those families scattered. Some stayed in Georgia, others moved north or west, but they all carried the trauma of those unexplained disappearances. Great-great-grandchildren grew up with stories of ancestors who went missing at Whitmore Hall, of the bad place where the Duchess did terrible things, of the 7 who were marked and taken. In 2023, the Equal Justice Initiative, working with genetic genealogy companies and historical societies, managed to locate living descendants of 6 of the 7 victims. Benjamin's line could not be traced definitively, as his children had been sold away from the plantation before their father's death, and records of their subsequent locations were lost. These descendants were invited to Savannah for a memorial service. They came from across the country, teachers, doctors, engineers, artists, all carrying forward the legacy of their ancestors' skills and resilience. They stood together in Bonaventure Cemetery, as the remains of their family members were finally given proper burial. Margaret Whitmore's mausoleum was slated for demolition. The Whitmore family agreed to pay for a new memorial that would honor the 7 victims, with their full names and stories told completely. The design included 7 pillars, each engraved with the accomplishments and character of the person it represented. But the ceremony of reburial was first. Each set of remains was placed in individual coffins, draped with kente cloth provided by the African American Heritage Council. A Baptist minister, a Yoruba priest, and a rabbi led the service, honoring the mixed spiritual traditions the 7 had held. Their names were spoken aloud, their lives celebrated, their deaths mourned with the full dignity they had been denied for 184 years. Rachel's great-great-great-granddaughter, a pediatrician named Dr. Jennifer Collins, spoke. She saved lives. She brought children into the world safely when death in childbirth was common. She healed people when medicine was primitive and often ineffective. She was a healer, and I carry that forward in my work every day. She was not defined by how she died. She is defined by how she lived. Isaiah's descendant, a furniture maker named Marcus Whitfield, said, "He created beauty. In a world that tried to reduce him to labor, he made art. Every piece of furniture I build is a continuation of his legacy." Dinah's great-great-great-great-grandson, a high school teacher named David Monroe, reflected, "She risked everything to teach children to read. She knew education was power, even when that knowledge could get her killed. I teach because she taught." That line continues unbroken. The service lasted 3 hours. 7 coffins were lowered into the ground in a new section of the cemetery, far from Margaret Whitmore's demolished mausoleum. 7 oak trees were planted, 1 over each grave, and 7 names were finally given the honor they deserved, carved in granite that would last for centuries. But the story didn't end with their burial. The discovery raised questions that Savannah and the nation had to confront. Chapter 6. The Weight of Memory. The demolition of the Whitmore Mausoleum began on a cold morning in January 2024. A crowd of several hundred people gathered to watch: descendants, historians, activists, journalists, and Savannah residents who felt the need to witness this moment. The structure that had stood for 167 years, representing the power and prestige of a family built on enslaved labor, was reduced to rubble in less than 4 hours. But destroying the physical monument couldn't erase the larger questions the discovery raised. Margaret Whitmore wasn't an aberration. She was an extreme example of a system that treated human beings as property. The ritualistic nature of her crimes, the spiritual dimension of her delusions, these were unique. But the fundamental evil she embodied was not. It was systematic, legal, and socially accepted. Dr. Amelia Torres, who had started the investigation with a photograph, became the lead researcher on a broader project examining hidden atrocities of the slavery era. Working with the Equal Justice Initiative and several universities, she helped establish a database of similar cases, crimes that exceeded even the normalized violence of slavery, acts that were hushed up or buried because they threatened the facade of Southern gentility. The research revealed dozens of cases across the South where enslaved people disappeared under suspicious circumstances, where plantation owners or overseers engaged in practices so extreme that even their own society tried to forget them. Margaret Whitmore wasn't alone in her monstrosity. She was simply one of the few whose crimes were eventually exposed. Savannah confronted its past in ways that were both painful and necessary. The City Council voted to fund a comprehensive historical marker program, identifying locations connected to the slave trade and acknowledging the suffering that had occurred there. Public schools revised their curriculum to include more detailed and honest accounts of slavery's impact on the region. Museums dedicated exhibitions to the lives of enslaved people, moving beyond generic narratives to tell specific stories of specific people. The Whitmore family, facing the reality of their ancestors' crimes, established a $5 million fund to support descendants of enslaved people from Whitmore Hall. They also donated the family's entire archive to the Georgia Historical Society, without restrictions, allowing researchers full access to documents that previous generations had kept private. But perhaps the most significant change was in how people talked about slavery. For too long, the narrative had been sanitized, reduced to abstractions about the peculiar institution and both sides of a historical debate. The discovery in the Whitmore Mausoleum forced confrontation with the specific individual horror. 7 real people with names, skills, families, and lives, murdered by someone who claimed to own them. The memorial to Rachel, Isaiah, Dinah, Thomas, Mary, Sarah, and Benjamin became a pilgrimage site. School groups visited to learn their stories. Descendants came to pay respects. Activists used the site to educate about the ongoing impact of historical trauma. The 7 pillars stood as a reminder that behind every statistic about slavery were individual human beings who suffered, resisted, hoped, and died. In 2025, a documentary about the case was released, featuring interviews with descendants, historians, and the preservation workers who made the discovery. The film, titled Marked the 7 of Whitmore Hall, won several awards and sparked national conversation about how America remembers and forgets its history. If this story has drawn you in, leave a like. It helps the story of Rachel, Isaiah, Dinah, Thomas, Mary, Sarah, and Benjamin reach more people who need to hear it. The Whitmore case also influenced legal discussions about historical justice. Some argued that the Whitmore family should face financial penalties beyond voluntary restitution. Others pointed out that punishing descendants for ancestral crimes was problematic, but that voluntary acknowledgement and reparation should be encouraged and celebrated. The debate continued in legal journals, churches, and public forums. For the descendants of the 7, the discovery brought both closure and renewed pain. Knowing what happened to their ancestors was a relief after generations of uncertainty. But learning the specific details of their murders reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Support groups formed, connecting people whose family members had suffered similar fates, creating communities of shared trauma and collective healing. The brick chapel where Margaret conducted her rituals had been demolished in 1856, but archaeological surveys identified its location. In 2024, researchers excavated the site, finding remnants of the items Dr. Hayes had mentioned: bones, cloth, and jars buried beneath the floor. Analysis confirmed these were elements of Margaret's ritual practices, physical evidence of her delusional belief system. These artifacts were carefully cataloged and placed in a museum collection, available for research but not for public display, respecting the traumatic nature of what they represented. The most powerful moment came in April 2025, during a ceremony marking 2 years since the discovery. Descendants of the 7 gathered with descendants of other enslaved people from Whitmore Hall to dedicate a second memorial. This one not for the victims of Margaret's ritual, but for all the people who had lived and worked at the plantation, the hundreds whose names history had forgotten. A 16-year-old girl named Amara Collins, Rachel's great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter, read a poem she had written. They tried to silence you with chains and stone, with marble monuments to the woman who called you owned, but silence is never permanent when truth demands its space. And now we speak your names and claim your rightful place. Not as victims only, though you were victimized, but as humans who lived fully until the day you died. Teachers, healers, builders, guides, people with families, people with pride. The woman who marked you thought she owned your soul, but souls can't be owned, they can't be controlled. You're free now, finally, properly laid to rest, and we, your descendants, continue your quest. To heal, to teach, to build, to lead, to be more than statistics in history's read. We are Rachel's hands that bring new life, Isaiah's craft cutting clean through strife, Dinah's lessons echoing through time, Thomas's wisdom reading nature's signs, Mary's and Sarah's unwavering faith, Benjamin's strength that no chains could break. They tried to bury you. They planted you with your murderer's name, but we dug you up, and now nothing's the same. The audience of 300 people stood in silence after she finished, the weight of 186 years pressing down on everyone present. Then, slowly, someone began to applaud, and the sound grew until it filled the cemetery, not celebration, but acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that these 7 people had finally been given the recognition they deserved, that their story had been told, that the silence had been broken. Subscribe to this channel to learn about more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the 7 from Whitmore Hall. I'll see you in the next video.